Welcome everyone to our audience here in person and also to our audience on the cloud joining us via Zoom. This is the first event in the Lawrenson Center's 2022 through 2023 program. And again, just a heartfelt welcome to our community members, to our students, faculty, staff, and even family members of Norm Lawrence. And Dr. Tom, it is great to have you here and to have you part of this event. We're delighted to have you, and this year we're going to be focusing all year on one particular question. How do we build a more trustworthy world? Throughout the year, we'll be engaging this question through the lens of democratic institutions and practices that in the current moment seem to be both critically important, but also fragile and vulnerable. Our presenter today, Dr. Yuval Levin, has played no small part in inspiring the theme of this year with his 2020 book, A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. Now, before introducing our speaker in a little bit greater detail, I want to invite up my predecessor, Dr. Per Anderson, if you would join me up here. Per served as the director of the Lawrenson Center last year and did a truly superb job, if I may say so, at helping us as a community to think rigorously about matters related to faith, work, the economy, and society. In fact, you can revisit all of those lectures. Last year, they are on our website, and there were quite a few just remarkable conversations, Per, so thanks for that. You recently retired after over 30 years of service to Concordia College. Congratulations. And as a token of our appreciation, I want to present Dr. Anderson with this original piece of pottery crafted by the master potter Richard Bresnahan, artist in residence at St. John's University. Richard is a remarkable human being, a remarkable person of faith, and a remarkable artist. Per, you and Richard, I think, share a few things in common. The first is a commitment to excellence. The second is a love for your respective vocations. And thirdly, you both have a deep and remarkable faith. And so thank you very much for all the service to the Lawrenson Center and to the school. And I hope you enjoyed this beautiful piece in your home. No. Thank you very much. Thank you. You can take that now or we can read it. Yeah. Thanks again, Per. Now, President Kraft regrets not being able to be here, so he did actually create a small video for us as a way of welcoming in the Lawrenson Center's programming this year. And so we'll turn to that video now and then to our introductions of the speaker.
Greetings to everyone, and welcome to this year's opening session for Concordia's Lawrenson Center for Faith and Work. I'm delighted to join you in lifting up the work of Dr. Michael Chan, Concordia's new Executive Director of Faith and Learning. Michael has been at work throughout the summer, planning the focus of the center, which is on building a more trustworthy world. With Dr. Chan, I am so pleased to introduce to you our speaker today, Yuval Levin. Dr. Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he also holds the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy. The founder and editor of National Affairs, he is also a senior editor at the New Atlantis, a contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. He writes a lot, and he writes well. Few texts match this year's Lawrenson focus on building a more trustworthy world, better than Dr. Levin's 2020 book, A Time to Build, whose full title reads, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. A friend here recently said to me that few colleges are better at preparing institutional leaders than Concordia, but he added, at the very moment when trust in institutions is at an all-time low. Why is that loss of trust so pervasive? Loss of trust in government, in the media, in big business, in the church, and yes, in some cases, in higher education. And how should institutions like ours respond? We know our purpose here. It is formative. Our purpose is to influence the affairs of the world by sending into society thoughtful and informed men and women dedicated to the Christian life, a life of love and care for our neighbor. In dialogue with Dr. Levin, we can think about our roles as teachers, learners, campus and community citizens. What are those roles? What is the work to which we are called right here and now? Thank you all for coming. Please join me now in thanking Michael Chan and in welcoming Yuval Levin to Concordia College.
Great. Thank you, President Kraft, for that video. I just want to add a couple of other things before we actually turn the time over to Dr. Levin. One is I would just want to say something about his public service record, his public service history. From 2001 to 2004, he served on the President's Council on Bioethics, and then from 2004 to 2007, he served as Special Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy under George W. Bush. And what we'll do now is I'm going to hand the time over to Dr. Levin, and he will offer a presentation. We will then hear from one of our faculty members and one of our students who will pose questions to him, and in the remaining time, we will have an opportunity to engage with him in Q&A. So, okay, thanks. Yuval, it's off to you.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that enormously, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be with you, even if remotely. And not just that, but grateful for the emphasis that you are putting this year on the question of not just trust, but trustworthiness, which I think is exactly the right way to approach the kinds of challenges we face. What I want to talk with you about today is that question of trust and trustworthiness, and really, in a sense, is the question of the kind of social crisis that we're living through in our society. The question of really what is it that's gone wrong in American life that has left us with the distinct kinds of problems we have. That something has gone wrong, I think, is pretty clear, but exactly what it is actually isn't quite as clear as we sometimes think or imagine. We know it's not just about the pandemic. We know it's not just about our politics. In a sense, our country is living through a social crisis. We can see that in everything from vicious partisan polarization to culture war resentments that seethe everywhere, to an upsurge of isolation and alienation and loneliness and despair that has sent suicide rates climbing, that's driven an epidemic of opioid abuse. These kinds of deep dysfunctions in what seem like very different parts of our society's life feel like they have some common roots. But what exactly are those roots? What is it that's gone wrong here? I think that part of the crisis, one of its symptoms, is that it's hard for us to get a handle on just what that is. Traditional economic concerns don't really cut it as explanations. Obviously, the pandemic has left us with economic challenges. We're dealing with inflation, maybe a recession, other consequences that will last. But the challenges I'm talking about didn't start with the pandemic, and they didn't ease during the long period of growth that we experienced in the previous decade. We had very low unemployment and inflation and interest rates, wages were rising. It's not that some Americans were not suffering economically, but the problems we had on that front don't add up to the crisis we're going through. Other familiar kinds of measures of well-being around health or safety or opportunity don't really offer obvious explanations either. So what is it that we've been complaining about? There are people who argue that there actually isn't anything to complain about, or that the frustration, the anxiety that seem to overwhelm us now are rooted in imaginary grievances, so that they themselves are the problem. Steven Pinker of Harvard takes these complaints to be kind of irritable gestures of self-indulgent ingratitude. So in a book he wrote a couple of years ago, he goes over just mountains of data on wealth and health and safety and choice, and concludes that populist complaints on all sides of our politics are detached from reality. Not just that, he says they're dangerous. Quote, indiscriminate pessimism can lead to fatalism, to wondering why we should throw time and money at a hopeless cause. And this can lead to radicalism, to calls to smash the machine, drain the swamp, or empower a charismatic tyrant, end quote. It's not a crazy view, but surely public frustration is not just some kind of self-delusion, especially frustration that runs this deep, that's revealed itself in such a broad range of symptoms. Pinker's happy data are not wrong, and neither are the encouraging economic indicators that we can point to over the last decade. But if these don't explain the reigning sentiments of our time, then we should ask ourselves what those kinds of indicators might be ignoring and what signs we might be missing. Our usual measures of wealth or health or personal freedom don't really explain the problem, because these are indicators, important as they are, of matters that are material and individual. They assess our well-being on our own. But none of us can actually experience well-being on our own. It's in the joints of society, at the junctures of individuals, that the trouble really shows itself. One way to put that point is that many of the struggles we have seem like they're rooted in relational problems. Loneliness, isolation, mistrust, suspicion, alienation, polarization. These are the characteristic troubles of our time, and they're failures of sociality. And so they can fall into a blind spot for our very individualist culture. So how do we explain a crisis of connectedness like that? Some people argue that the trouble is philosophical, almost metaphysical, that liberalism has failed because it fails to offer us a sufficient vocabulary or architecture for solidarity. Other people say that although traditional measures of growth or prosperity look okay, our problem is still economic in a deeper sense. It's socioeconomic. They say that contemporary capitalism creates levels of inequality that make it impossible for people to feel like equal parts of a larger whole, or to believe in the legitimacy of our political and economic order. Other people say that external pressures like trade or immigration, or internal pressures like racism or identity politics, have left us just unable to hang together. I think there's some truth to all these explanations. They all get at something important because they treat the human person as embedded in a larger whole, whether that's metaphysical or moral or social or economic. And they see that what's gone wrong has to do with the way in which we now live out that embeddedness. But I think they still miss something rather crucial. When we think about our problems in these ways, we tend to imagine our society as a kind of vast open space that's filled with people who are having trouble linking hands, right? Trouble connecting. And so we talk about breaking down walls and building bridges and leveling playing fields. But there's a missing step between joining together and actually recovering belonging and trust and legitimacy. What we're missing, although we too rarely really put it this way, is not just connectedness, but a structure of social life, a way to give shape and purpose and concrete meaning and identity to the things we do together. And if American life is a big open space, it's not a space filled with individuals. It's a space filled with these structures of social life. It's a space filled with institutions. And we're too often failing to foster belonging and legitimacy and trust because we're living through more than just a failure of connection, but a failure of institutions. Institutions do more than connect us. That understanding our social crisis in terms of what they are and what they do could help us to see that crisis in a new light. That's the kind of understanding that I want to gesture toward this afternoon. So what is an institution? It won't surprise you to learn that there are a lot of different kinds of academic definitions of a term like that. I think through some of those in the book that Michael mentioned, but for our purposes, let me suggest a general definition that draws together a lot of that academic work, but also looks to the problems that we confront in our society now. By institutions, I mean the durable forms of our common life. They're the shapes and structures of what we do together. Some institutions are organizations. They have something like a corporate form, a university, a hospital, a school, a business, a civic association. These are institutions, and they're technically, legally formalized. Some institutions are durable forms of a different kind. Maybe they're shaped by laws or norms, but without a corporate structure. The family is an institution. It's the first and foremost institution of any society. We can speak about the institution of marriage, or a particular tradition or a profession as an institution. The rule of law is an institution. That they are durable is essential. An institution keeps its shape over time, and so it shapes the realm of life in which it operates. It usually changes gradually, incrementally. Flash mobs are not institutions. But most important, what's distinct about an institution is that it is a form in the deepest sense. A form is a structure, a contour. It's the shape of the whole, the organization that speaks of its purpose and its logic, its function, its meaning. A social form, an institution, is not just a bunch of people. It's a bunch of people who are ordered together to achieve a purpose pursue a goal, advance an ideal. And that means that the institution is also, by its nature, formative. Institutions structure our interactions, and as a result, they structure us. They shape our habits, they shape our expectations, ultimately, they shape our character, they shape our souls. They help to form us. And that formative role actually has a lot to do with how institutions relate to the social crisis that we're living through. So let me say a word about how that is. When we think about the role of institutions in American life now, we might tend, first of all, to think in terms of a loss of trust or confidence in them. And you're spending time this year thinking about trust and trustworthiness. The loss of confidence and trust in institutions is a trend we hear a lot about. It's very easy to find measures of it, and they paint a very grim picture. Gallup, the polling organization, has kept track of what it calls Americans' confidence in institutions for many decades now, in most cases since 1973, right through today. And the trend in those figures is unmistakable. From big business and banks and the professions to the branches of the federal government to the news media and the academy, it's found that confidence in our institutions has been plummeting pretty consistently. In the early 1970s, about 80% of Americans said that they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in doctors and hospitals, for example. Last year, that figure was 36%. 40 years ago, 65% of Americans said they had a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in organized religion. Last year, that figure was 39%. 60% said they had a lot of confidence in public schools back then. It's just about a third of Americans who would say that now. Even in 1975, a year after Richard Nixon resigned from the presidency in disgrace, 52% of Americans said they had a lot of confidence in the American presidency. Last year, 32% said so. Gallup even found, this may be the most amazing to me, that 42% of the public said they had a lot of confidence in Congress in the 1970s. Last year, that figure was 12%. And honestly, even that seems high. You sort of wonder, who are these 12%? That pattern holds for a lot of the institutions Gallup asked about, almost all of them. The military is actually the only major exception among national institutions. We can think a little bit about why that is. But the overall trend is unmistakable. The American public has gone from extraordinary levels of confidence in our major institutions to really striking levels of mistrust. But what do we actually mean when we say we don't trust institutions? I think the answer to that has a lot to do with what institutions really are, what they do. It takes us back to that question of how they form us. Every significant institution in society carries out some important task, maybe educating children or enforcing the law or serving the poor, or just providing some good or service. It does that by establishing a structure and a process, again, a form for combining people's efforts toward accomplishing that task. And in the process, the institution also forms those people to carry out that work effectively, responsibly, reliably. It shapes the people within it to be trustworthy. And that's a lot of what it means to trust an institution. We trust an institution when it seems to have an ethic that makes the people within it more trustworthy. So we trust political institutions when they seem to take seriously some obligation to the public interest, and they form the people in them to do the same. We trust the military because it values courage or honor or duty in carrying out the defense of the country, and it shapes men and women who clearly share that ethic, that value. We trust a business because it promises quality and integrity in meeting some need that we have, and it rewards its people when they deliver those. We trust a school because it builds a culture that makes its people devoted to learning and teaching and keeping students safe and happy. We trust a journalistic institution when we do, because it has high standards of honesty and accuracy in reporting the news, and it makes the work of its people trustworthy. We lose faith in an institution, it seems to me, when we lose the sense that it plays that kind of ethical or formative role, shaping the people within it to be trustworthy. And one way that can happen is when institutions claim to enforce an ethic of responsibility, but just plainly fail to do that, and instead end up shielding or empowering bad behavior. When a bank cheats its customers, when a member of the clergy abuses a child, that kind of gross abuse of power obviously undermines public trust in institutions. It's a familiar kind of corruption. But it's not new. There are plenty of examples of it in our time, unfortunately, but there are plenty of examples of it in every time. So it doesn't quite explain the distinctive loss of confidence in institutions in our time. Another related but different way in which an institution can lose our trust is when it simply fails to impose an ethic on the people within it altogether and doesn't even seem to see that kind of formation as its purpose. When the people in the institution no longer see it as a mold of their character and their behavior, but rather see it as more like a platform for themselves to perform on, to raise their profiles, to be seen. An institution like that seems not to be worthy of our trust, not so much because it's failed to earn it, but because it seems not even to seek it, to desire it. And something like that is what's been happening to a lot of our institutions in recent decades in America. When we don't think of institutions as formative, but as performative, when the presidency and Congress are just stages for performative outrage, when a university becomes just a venue for virtue signaling, when journalism is hard to distinguish from activism, when the church becomes a political stage, they become harder to trust. They seem not to be working on the people in them, but displaying those people to the larger world. They're not asking for our trust. They're just asking for our attention. And in our time, a lot of the most significant social and political and cultural and intellectual institutions are in the process of going through this kind of transformation from mold to platform. The few exceptions, again, maybe most notably the military, the most unabashedly formative of our national institutions, tend to prove that rule because they tend to be the few institutions in which we are not losing faith. And many of the genuinely novel institutions of the 21st century, especially those virtual institutions of social media, are inherently shaped as platforms to begin with and not as molds. It would be strange, I think, to trust a platform, and we don't. This change of attitudes, this decline in the expectation that our institutions should be formative, is at the heart of a lot of our loss of trust in institutions. And that is in turn at the heart of our broader social crisis too, because institutions understood as platforms rather than as molds, as stages to perform on more than as means to form and shape character, are less able to offer us objects of loyalty, sources of legitimacy, means of building mutual trust. Examples of that kind of transformation from mold to platform are everywhere around us now. And in a lot of cases, our institutions are being made into platforms not just for any kind of performance, but for performative virtue and performative outrage in that vast polarized culture war that seems to be everywhere now. In one institution after another, we find people who should think of themselves as insiders shaped by the distinct purpose and integrity of the institution, instead operating as outsiders, displaying themselves, building their own personal brand on the institution more than in it. This is obvious in politics. I mean, is there any question that a lot of members of Congress now run for office less to be involved in legislative work and more to have a prominent platform in the culture war, to become more visible on cable news or on talk radio, to build a social media following, to use their elected office mostly as a platform to complain, often about the very institution that they worked so hard to be elected to. They see that as what their voters want, and they're always performing for that core partisan audience. Is there any question that the political parties now have just become platforms too, stages for narcissists to stand and yell on? But look beyond politics. Think about the profession of journalism, for example, as an example. Its institutional strength is its insistence on a formative integrity, on a process of editing and verification that helps us to be sure that what is providing us is reliable. But today, a lot of elite journalists constantly step outside of those institutional constraints and address the public directly on social media or on cable news, building their own personal brands on a platform rather than participating in the work of an institution. If you check in on Twitter right now, you'd find a lot of professional reporters essentially deprofessionalizing themselves in real time. You can see the same kind of pattern in parts of the American Academy today. Rather than serving the institutional purpose of the university, which is to form some portion of the rising generation through teaching and learning, we find many in the university using the institution as a platform for virtue signaling, for political and culture war theatrics. There's a version of this in some portions of American religion, where institutions that exist to form and transform souls are being used instead as platforms for political theater, for culture war drama, so that the cachet of the church is used less to form the people within it than to let them express themselves in the public arena. We see that pattern throughout American life. That distortion of institutionalism amounts in practical terms to the great unasked question of this time in America. Given my role here, how should I behave? That's the question that someone who takes seriously an institution that they're involved with would ask. And a lot of the trouble facing our core institutions now can be described as a widespread failure to ask that question. Given my role here, how should I behave? As the president of the United States or a member of Congress, as a teacher, as a scientist, as a pastor or a worker, a parent, a neighbor, what should I do here? I would bet that the people that you most respect these days seem to ask that kind of question before they make important judgments, almost instinctively. And that the people who drive you crazy, who you really think are part of the problem, seem to fail to ask that question in situations when they just obviously should. And we find ourselves wondering, how could that person have done that, given the position they have? That's one way to understand the transformation of our expectations of institutions, which has so much to do with the broader set of problems that we're dealing with. That transformation has left a lot of Americans with a sense that our institutions can't be trusted, that they're not even in the business of trying to earn our trust. And that's left a lot of us short of sources of formation and belonging and legitimacy and social cohesion. That problem doesn't simply explain the social crisis we're living through, obviously, but it's one important factor behind that crisis, and one that I think we're particularly likely to miss or to ignore, because we're just not very good at seeing institutions and grasping what they're for. So what can we do about it? Obviously, there's no simple answer to that question. There's no policy agenda that just gives us a to-do list here. But I think that dealing with this problem requires to begin with a change of mindset. Witnessing failures of responsibility in so many of our institutions, we're tempted to a disposition to demolish, to uproot. We're tempted to think that only outsiders can save us. And that's why so much of the energy of our politics now is spent tearing down those supposedly powerful establishments. But in fact, I don't think we need more outsiders who pretend that they're just critics with no power to act. We need more insiders, institutionalists who will be earnest, both in their efforts to build frameworks for common action and in their acceptance of the duties that accompany power in institutions. Those in our society who have the most power, our leaders, our elites, need especially to resist the urge to pretend that they're outsiders, as so many of them do now. But everyone else does too. Instead, we should all try to embrace the responsibilities that come with whatever positions we have, and we should ensure that obligations and restraints protect and empower and form us. We need to inhabit the institutions that we're part of, to love them where necessary, to reform them so that they might be more lovely to other people too. We need to understand ourselves as formed by these institutions and to act accordingly, to ask ourselves in those little moments of decision, not just what do I want, but what should I do here given my role or my position, my responsibility to these other people. Questions like those seem like an awfully small response to the kinds of enormous social problems that I started with. And of course, they're only a start, but they're how we can begin to work toward a change of mindset. And they can add up, they can make a difference. If our leaders asked them more often, I think our politics would be improved a lot. If professionals in many fields thought this way just a little bit more, it would be easier to trust their expertise, to accept their claims to authority. If the people who participate in all the institutions that we're part of tried to think this way more, it would be easier to feel like we belong to something worthwhile. That sort of change of mindset is not a substitute for institutional reform, but it's an essential prerequisite for it. And we do need institutional reform. I want to be clear that I don't think the problem to be solved is that people don't trust our institutions. The problem to be solved, just as your program for this year suggests, is that our institutions are not trustworthy enough. It's also important to recognize that there are some serious reasons to be careful and skeptical about trusting institutions. There are obviously a lot of ways in which institutions can be oppressive. They can limit our freedom of choice. They impose hierarchies on us. They can be slow to change and hard to move. More than that, there are some institutions in our society that are literally oppressive. The term institutionalized racism, for example, is not a metaphor in America. It's a reality. The disposition against strong institutions arose for serious reasons. And the arguments for transparency and individualism and for weakening institutions emerged as correctives to some excessively rigid and imperious kinds of institutionalism. Worries like that are serious. They need to be heeded. But we have to see that populism and individualism and anti-institutionalism come with their own very serious trade-offs. Institutions can be terribly oppressive, and yet we cannot do without them. In fact, functional institutions are actually most important for people who don't have power or positions of authority and resources and strength in our society. And although our institutions can become constricting and cold, they're actually essential to our acting on our warmest sentiments in our society. Without them, we become isolated, we become alienated, we become disillusioned. That's the irony that we face in this moment in America. The failures of our institutions have led us to demand that they be uprooted, that they be demolished, but we can't address those failures without renewing and rebuilding those very institutions. It makes sense to resist the excesses of institutional strength, but our problems today are more like excesses of institutional weakness. And so they require recommitment and reform rather than just resentment. In one arena after another of American life, we face the challenge of drawing alienated people back into our institutions. We can point to all kinds of complicated theories about how to build trust that would be required to accomplish that. But the simplest way is for the people who inhabit our institutions, that is, for all of us, to work on being more trustworthy. And that really is something that we each can work on wherever we are in American life. We can give our institutional responsibilities more of our time and effort. We can give them more of our identity and self-consciousness. We can understand ourselves as defined by the institutions that matter most to us. We can judge ourselves by their standards, hold ourselves up to their ideals, take seriously their kind of integrity, align our pride and our ambition with theirs a little more. We can work to reform them when they're failing, to help them work better and be more worthy of trust. And we can yearn not just for that kind of formless autonomy of the independent contractor, but for the rootedness and the responsibility of the member and the partner and the worker and the owner and the citizen. There's a word for attitudes like that. The word is devotion. What's required of each of us is devotion to the work we do together with others in the service of a common aspiration that matters to us. And so devotion to the institutions that we compose and inhabit together. That kind of devotion calls for sacrifice and for commitment sometimes. It calls on each of us to pledge ourselves to some institution that we belong to unabashedly, to abandon ironic distance and dispassionate analysis sometimes and just jump in. And that kind of devotion is not only necessary, I think it's actually very attractive right now. We want objects of devotion. We want something to commit to and belong to. But we often don't see that what we're looking for is really right within our reach. It's very easy to be fashionable rebels in this moment in America. It's harder to remind ourselves why our core commitments are worthwhile. And that's the kind of case that institutionalism would have to involve now. In the wake of these couple of years of pandemic in particular, we can see the contours of the problem especially clearly. We can see why it's so hard to trust expertise, but also why we need expertise. We can see why people recoil from claims to authority, but also why we need reliable, responsible leaders. That we need authoritative institutions, but don't want them, is one way to think about the challenge that the pandemic constantly put before us, and more broadly about the challenge that this period in American life has forced us to think about. And it's not easy to see how to escape the contradiction that's presented in that challenge. But I want to suggest to you that the way out of it is to see that we require a change of mindset and a recovery of responsibility, that we each can be part of that. It's not just something that other people need to do. It's something that all of us can begin to do by changing how we think about the obligations and the roles that we have in our lives. What I'm proposing here, in other words, is a modest change in our stance toward our country and toward the crisis it confronts, not a social revolution or a political transformation, at least not to begin with, just a greater awareness of how integrity and trust and confidence and belonging and meaning are actually established in our lives. And so a greater care about some of the habits that we've gotten into that tend to cut us off from those. Thinking and speaking just a little differently about how we live together can make a huge difference, much bigger than we might imagine. And that, in the end, is the character of the kind of transformation that we need. The demolition crews have been allowed for too long to define the spirit of this era in America. But where we're headed is ultimately going to be up to the builders and the rebuilders. And that's what each of us should seek to be. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yuval, for that thoughtful presentation. We're going to turn now to an opportunity for engagement, and I'd like to first invite up Professor Eric Schmidt, one of our political, oh, I'm sorry, my apologies, Katie Gerlach, my apologies, sorry, Katie. Katie's one of our political science students, and she's going to be offering the first response and question. Thanks, Katie. Good to have you here.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and also thank you to Dr. Levin for taking time to come and talk to us. We really appreciate your time and your insight on the subject matter. Dr. Levin, in your book, you say, and I quote, that liberal democracy is not under the kind of stress today that it faced in the 1930s or even the 1960s, eras of fascism and communism on the march abroad and intense political violence and cultural self-doubt at home, end quote. Given this book was published in January of 2020, have recent events such as accusations of the 2020 election being fraudulent, the January 6th insurrection and investigations that followed, as well as tensions abroad seen in Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and China's increased hostility to Taiwan, changed your outlook on the matter of the stress pressing on liberal democracy? And if so, would the same ways of strengthening our institutions mentioned in your book still apply in this new context?
Thank you very much. It's a wonderful question, a very important question. As you say, the book was published at the beginning of 2020, and a lot has happened since then. The pandemic, for one thing, the election for another, and the attempt, frankly, by the loser of the election to stay in power, and thereby to assault the foundations of American democratic constitutionalism. As you say, the world's also a dangerous place. But the argument made in that passage you said in the book is that the problems we face are particularly serious because they are problems that have to do with our internal integrity more than with external pressures. And I do think that even some of the problems I've described here may be best understood as functions of the weakening integrity and the weakening confidence we have in our institutions, more than as external pressures. And so I do think this is, for all of its enormous dangers, a less dangerous moment than America faced, say, in the 1860s, or even in the 1930s, even really in the late 1960s. You know, it's easy for us now, looking back on it, and most of us were born after that time, I was, to look at that period and downplay the enormous, intense dangers and tensions that the country faced in each of those times. But just to take the late 1960s, a time that we might compare ourselves to now, or the 1970s, which in some ways this moment resembles, in the summer of 1968 in Washington, D.C., the city where I live, 1 in 5 buildings in the city was burned down in riots. Riots that followed, of course, a period of intense political violence, division, and breakdown. We do live in a tough moment now. I don't want to suggest that our democracy is not facing very real threats, but our democracy has stood up to very, very serious tensions and threats in the past. The question is, how has it done that, and how could it do it now? And I think the reason to worry is that oftentimes it has done that by being able to lean on some degree of mutual trust and confidence, and even some trust in institutions that's been a kind of background fact of American life. The statistics that I cited in the course of the talk about trust in institutions begin in that sort of middle part of the 20th century. And even in the course of a very, very divided time in the late 1960s in America, Americans had a lot of trust in institutions. In the wake of the Second World War and of the Depression, of the massive public response to those crises, Americans walked away from that period with a lot of self-confidence. We are now in a moment of that is terribly lacking in self-confidence in our society, and with some reason. And so I do think that to deal with the kinds of problems we have, we need to invest ourselves in some rebuilding of confidence in our institutions, which means in rebuilding the trustworthiness of those institutions, precisely by thinking about how do we take responsibility for those parts of American life that are ours, that we have a part in, that we play some role in, whether that's being part of a university, whether that's being part of a profession, whether that's being involved in public life, whether it's just playing a role in your neighborhood. We each now should see that we have a role to play in building up the kind of public trust that's necessary for dealing with the problems we face. I certainly do think that there are deeper problems now than were apparent even when I finished writing the book at the end of 2019, but they're of the same sort. And it does seem to me that in order to think about those problems, we have to help ourselves think institutionally a little more than we're naturally inclined to.
Katie, thank you for that thoughtful question, and Yuval, thank you for the equally thoughtful response. Now I'd like to welcome up Professor Eric Schmidt from the Department of Political Science, who will be offering a brief response and question, and then after that, we'll kind of break it open to the audience, both virtual and in person.
Perfect, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Dr. Levin. Can everybody hear me? Okay, and thank you, Dr. Levin, for your presentation and for writing such a wonderful lyrical book. My question involves the difference between explicitly non-political and explicitly political institutions and whether that difference matters for your argument. I'm going to unpack this briefly. In your book and in your presentation, you describe lots of different institutions, churches, universities, the family, and you suggest, I think correctly, that these institutions can be the basis for moral formation, even if they're not filling that role right now. But you spend considerably less time on the institutions that I teach about. I'm here today with my class on political parties and interest groups. You mentioned parties briefly in your presentation, but except for elections, political parties and interest groups are, I would argue, unquestionably the most important linking institutions that we have. And by linking institution, of course, I mean an institution that connects the people with their elected representatives. These are institutions that serve explicitly political ends and can be profoundly amoral. While they can be dominated by elites, neither parties nor interest groups are exclusively elite-driven. The U.S. is obsessed with using primary elections to select nominees for virtually every partisan race. The right to organize politically is enshrined in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. And by most accounts, these institutions are a big reason why representative government can happen at all. And there's the rub, I think. Few people would say that parties or interest groups promote moral formation most of the time. Far from shaping our souls, the institutions that I study and that I teach about have an amorality to them, as I said, that nonetheless ends up being very instrumental for practical politics. So my question is twofold, and thanks for bearing with me. First, when you advocate that we rebuild institutions, does this include institutions like political parties and interest groups with explicitly political and instrumental goals? And if so, what does that look like? And second, even more generally, if we're going to be clear and honest about what institutions are for, how do you grapple with the fact that American democracy depends upon institutions, again, like parties, that show little promise of ever fostering or promoting moral formation?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's a wonderfully put question, and it is so in the sense that it compels me to offer a different kind of vision of what a political party is than I think is the one that you're suggesting. I actually think political parties can be very important socially and morally formative institutions, because political parties ultimately are arrangements of people who want to offer up a sense of what they understand to be the common good, put it in front of their fellow citizens, and see where they can find agreement and build coalitions. It's true, of course, that there's an element of self-interest to anybody's involvement in democratic politics, that there's an element of group interest in the work of interest groups, naturally. But I also think that the nature of a democratic polity and of a republic like ours is that it forces citizens who want something out of politics to approach their fellow citizens with an argument about the common good. Not just to say, this is what we want, and there are a lot of us, so you got to give it to us, but to say, this is what we want, and for these reasons, we think it would be good for you as well. Now, obviously, that is a stylized kind of idealistic way of describing what happens in politics. But I think that in practical terms, because of the need to build coalitions, the need to win elections, the need to get a majority behind you, and in our system, very often a supermajority and a durable supermajority that lingers over time, the system does compel us to make arguments that begin from our own good in terms of the good of other people too. So I just don't agree that the American political parties have not been morally formative institutions. The Democratic Party was formed to advance an idea of the public good rooted in a Jeffersonian sense of what it takes to form a Republican citizen. And I think that vision has never really been lost. The Republican Party was formed to combat slavery and to advance a vision of the good rooted in the Declaration of Independence. And that vision, too, I think remains very important in American politics. Obviously, the parties have kind of switched roles and places in a variety of ways and wrestled one another into one another's coats, as Lincoln put it. So that, these days, the Democratic Party tends to be more the party of civil rights. The Republican Party tends to be more the party of civil liberties. And, that process is continuing. We still are fighting about what's good for the country, what do our ideals mean, what our interests are, what we want out of politics. But those struggles, because of the nature of our democracy, are forced and channeled into a form that turns them into arguments about what would be good for all of us. And I do think that a lot of the time, our politics as a result is an argument about the future of the country. More than that, I think political parties have been very constructively formative institutions over time. The Democratic Party was very involved, for example, in the integration of immigrants in American cities at the beginning of the 20th century. They did it because they wanted voters. They didn't really hide that, but they did it. And played a hugely important role in allowing immigrants from Ireland and from Poland and from elsewhere to become integrated into American civic life in a way that ultimately was very constructive. I certainly think that there are ways that both parties have played this kind of role. They do it for their own reasons, absolutely. And I would not suggest that their motivations are profoundly moralistic at bottom, but the system does compel them to approach the larger society in terms of what would be good for everyone, and tries to form our politics into a debate about what would be good for the country. That debate is messy. It's often, a circus, and these days more than usual. But I absolutely do think that political parties are among those institutions that we should strive to revitalize and revive. I think the parties are too weak today. They've been weakened by, as you say, by our fetish for primaries, by kind of over-democratization. The parties have a role to play that is, in some important ways, an elite role in choosing candidates and agendas, putting those before the public, and then allowing democracy to have a choice. I think strengthening the parties and giving them more of a role in candidate selection is one of the ways in which we would need to strengthen our democracy. And so, maybe I'm naive, but I think you have to be a little naive about the things you love most. And in loving this country, I love the parties too.
Thanks. Thank you, Katie and Eric, for getting us started on engagement, and thanks for that response. Now, we have a good amount of time, reasonable amount of time to engage in some conversation, but I will say this, we've got about, maybe 11 minutes, not so much time, but we'll take some time for engagement, so start to think about where your questions might be, and then I'll also say that as part of our larger program this year, we do have a hybrid book club, or a virtual book club, and we'll be reading Dr. Levin's book as part of that in September. September. And he has graciously agreed to join us toward the end of that month in that virtual book group to discuss that further. So if you don't get your question asked today, there will be another opportunity. Okay, I want to invite our folks online to feel free to use the Q&A option there. And for those in person, you can feel free to use the microphone at the front. So if there are questions, please, do you mind using the microphone? Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, first of all, for joining us. This was really an informative lecture. But you spoke of formative versus pre-formative institutions. And what I'm mostly interested in is educational institutions, speaking of high schools and universities in particular. I really understand the importance of formative or forming specific social or political behaviors, but at the same time I have concern of that limiting the ability for some people to have the performative rights that they need to have, such as self-expression or freedom of speech. Do you think, or how do you suggest that we navigate these tricky waters between forming good citizens that are fully engaged and good for the institutions, but at the same time giving people the right for self-expression so that they can make those institutions better in the future?
Yeah, thank you. It's a fantastic question, and it's a question that has to be on our minds constantly as we think about this set of issues. I think about it in terms of a kind of balance. I think that there are times when the balance between expression and formation leans too far in the direction of formation, and it's too constricting and forces people to conform to a mainstream culture to an excessive degree. If you look at American culture in the middle of the 20th century, say at the end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s, you find a culture that is just screaming for liberation from conformity. Left and right, up and down, wherever you look, whether that's in the kinds of novels that were popular, whether that's what was being said by Democrats and Republicans, what was being said by leading religious leaders and political leaders, there was a sense that the conformism of mid-century, the conformism of an era of mobilization in war and depression had gone way too far. And there was not nearly enough room for people to express themselves, to be themselves, to live their own lives and identities. And we began in that time a process of liberalization where a lot of the most powerful voices in American life went from saying, be like everybody else, to saying, be yourself. And I think there was tremendous good done by that liberation. But we are at a moment now when I think we lean too far in the other direction. We lack sources of cohesion. We lack sources of unity. We've come to see each other too often as enemies and not as friends and fellow citizens. There's not enough of a mainstream. There's been a tremendous fragmentation. And we now are looking and screaming in the same way that they were for liberation from conformity. We're looking for sources of solidarity. And I think you find this on all sides of our politics too, left and right. It's behind some of the energy that drives people toward various kinds of identity politics. It's behind some of the energy that drives people toward various forms of nationalism. I think these are all ways of looking for something to hold us together, to be part of something larger than yourself. And it seems to me that in a moment like this, what we need to be reminded of is the importance of institutional connections and institutional strength. That's not always what we need to be reminded of. And there certainly have been times, and I'm sure there will be again, when what we need to remind ourselves of in American life is the importance of individual freedom and identity and difference, is the importance of free speech and expression. Those are always important, both of them are. And our politics tends to move like a pendulum from one excess to another. And so I think that in this moment, in this kind of time, we need ways of seeing institutions and thinking about them. And that's why it's important to talk about it now. But that is not to the exclusion, that is not to the denial of the importance of both free expression and individual freedom itself. It just seems to me that we always have to try to be responding to the problems we face in the moment. And our kind of polity, of constitutionalism, always lives in tension between these things. It wants at the same time to empower majorities and protect minorities. It wants at the same time to empower expression and create some cohesion. And that means that we swing from one end to another. And, you know, in the middle between them is where we live as a free society.
Thanks for an excellent question and for the response. We'll take, here's one more question we'll do from our one of our online participants. A distinctive strength of Concordia College is how it combines strengths in professional education, business, management, finance, nursing, pre-med, accounting, social work, etc., with the liberal arts education. Institutions are made of persons, professionals who are trained in certain ways. The liberal arts, including humanities, can help educate future professionals to have a more capacious understanding of the common good and the public goods that professions seek to promote. Can this kind of wider education help build trustworthy institutions by forming professionals with insight into the common good? Did you catch all that?
Great question, and I'm a great believer in that kind of liberal education as a way of forming good human beings and citizens. It's of course also a way of forming better professionals, and so I do think. I mean, look, the trouble is this is often available only to a select slice of American society, and we have to think about how to make it accessible and available to more Americans, how to allow more people to benefit from the enormous wealth that our civilization has to offer. This is clearly part of the role of a university, and universities should not become simply narrowly focused professional schools. And so that's just by way of saying, I think that kind of formation, a formation that gives people some roots in the deepest sources of wisdom and guidance and instruction, is absolutely essential to making people capable of being free citizens. But you know, it's not the easiest thing to make it available to everyone. I think that's one of the challenges that we've always faced in America and that we do now. When you look at the way that some of the American founders who thought most seriously about education thought about what a university would be for, those are exactly the terms they had in mind. But the terms they used were very elitist terms. They thought this would only be of use to a very narrow slice of our society. I think it would be of use to a much broader slice of our society.
Yeah, thank you. As I said, I'm sure there are many, many other questions. I hope you all will join us for the virtual or hybrid book club. The way you can do that is you'll notice that there are business cards on your table. On the back side of those is a QR code. And if you click on that QR code, flash it with your camera, it'll take you to a registration form where you can sign up for the book club. The first 10 registrants will actually receive a free copy of the book, so get it done quick. And for those of us in our online audience, we're going to share that here in just a moment. You'll see both the QR code and the link. I will also make sure that if you registered for the event, you'll receive an email that also has the same link. The last thing I want to mention is that we have a really interesting lineup of speakers coming up this year. Just to take a couple of examples, Catherine Finney from Genius Guild will be joining us in January. Catherine is a remarkable entrepreneur, Yale-trained epidemiologist who found her way into entrepreneurial matters, and she's a partner at Genius Guild, and they invest in Black and minority businesses, and some remarkable results have come from that. Christine Emba from the Washington Post will join us in the spring in February to talk about the role of journalism within democracy, and then in October, you can go to the next slide. It'll be up there in just a moment, I think. If not, no problem. In October on the 20th, we'll be joined by Kat Moore, who is a philosopher and also the director of Belonging at USC. And she's going to help us think through the role of friendship and belonging in democracy as a democratic practice. It should be quite interesting. So as you can tell, we have an interesting number of speakers coming up. And I just want to conclude by saying thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your engagement. And Yuval, most especially, thank you to you for joining us today and later in September.